Thank you so much, Dr. Ferguson, for this wonderful opportunity to share some of thoughts about a topic that is truly close to my heart, consciousness. And thank you so much, Dr. Vold. Very interesting conversation. I look forward to our conversation. So my name is Kletenik. I'm a behavioral neurologist at Brigham and Women's Hospital. And behavioral neurology is really a subfield of neurology that focuses on disorders of language, memory, affect, and thought. And so I come to questions from a clinical standpoint, from a patient standpoint. So when you look up at the sky and you behold the blue sky, or you look up at the mountain, you're having a very well-formed conscious phenomenal experience. There's something it's like to see the color blue. There's something it's like to look up at the mountain. And if there's one point that I can hopefully get across from today's talk, it's that consciousness, phenomenal experience, is related to a biological process. And that biological process can be empirically investigated for its underlying physiology. For much of human history, it was not believed that the brain was important for thought and experience. Most philosophers and scientists for thousands of years thought the heart or other organs were more important in consciousness and phenomenal experience and having experiences. But there is one rare exception in a treatise that's attributed to Hippocrates that called The Sacred Disease, where he studies epilepsy. And he was studying patients who had traumatic brain injuries and had seizures afterwards. And he concluded, given that people who had injuries to their head were having seizures, that it was the brain that was involved in thought. A famous quote from his treatise on the sacred diseases: "People ought to know that from nothing else but the brain come joy, delight, laughter, and sports, and sorrow, griefs, despondency, and lamentations. And by this, in a special manner, we acquire wisdom and knowledge, and see and hear, and know what are foul and what are fair, what are bad and what are good, and what are sweet and what unsavory." I think this formulation is a little bit strong, and I'd like to use the term instead associated or correlated, rather than only from the brain. But I still think that at this point, the neuroscientific revolution, the neurological revolution, is really founded on the sense that many important affective, cognitive, memory, and other processes seem to be related to focal areas of the brain. This is the organization, a functional organization of the brain that has emerged from a lot of neuroscience and neurology, and a lot of it emerges from lesion studies. People will have a lesion in a specific area, and then they'll have a loss of function. So if somebody has an injury on the primary motor cortex, they will end up not being able to move the contralateral other side of the body. If somebody has an injury to the primary visual cortex, they'll no longer be able to see the part of the visual field that's observed by that part of the brain. This has been very well validated and has repeatedly been shown to be a very useful way of thinking about the brain. In a hospital, you can see patient after patient who have strokes, tumors, and brain lesions, where their symptoms associate very clearly with specific areas of the brain. And so in the early days of neurology, in modern neurology, there was the attempt to take patients with many different brain lesions and to see many different symptoms, the same symptom, and see where their lesions overlap. And some key examples where this is a very successful method in neurology are those of aphasia, where people have a disruption of language. This is the brain from the patient Tan, who was studied by Paul Broca. Tan had an injury to his left inferior frontal gyrus. You can see the area right there. And he had what's now called a non-fluent aphasia, or Broca's aphasia. In this area of the brain is now called Broca's area for that reason. And what it is that he had an injury there, and he could understand language. If you asked him to do something, he could follow it. But when he would speak, he couldn't express anything. And so it was understood that the inferior frontal gyrus is very important for the production of language. And this has been shown in patient after patient. You can see people with strokes in the blood vessels that feed this region who come into the hospital with an acute loss of the ability to produce language. Similarly, this is another patient. This is HM, who now we know his name was Henry Molaison, who ended up having seizures that were refractory, could not go away. And he ended up going through a radical surgery to remove both of his temporal lobes, the medial temporal lobes. And what he had was a dense anterior great amnesia, which means he was not able to form new episodic memories. You could go in and talk to him and leave the room, and you come back in 5 minutes later, he wouldn't remember seeing you. Other forms of memory that are in different areas of the brain, like procedural memory, learning how to draw a star in a mirror, he was able to learn. And so again and again, we've learned that the medial temporal lobes are very important for the formation of episodic memories. In Alzheimer's disease, these areas are preferentially atrophied. Michael has a really beautiful paper in Nature looking at some of the roles of the hippocampus in episodic memory. Other ways to think about the brain. You can think about it on a cellular level. There are neurons, and there's complex interwoven dendritic processes that interweave these neurons in a complex network of electrical stimulation. You can think about the brain at a neurotransmissional level as well. This is the acetylcholine networks that are very important in wakefulness and vigilance. There's many other ways to think about it, and modern neuroimaging techniques have also led to other functional imaging, where you can see how the brain is not just on a structural level, where there's a focal lesion, but also how the brain is functioning, how it's using glucose, for example. This is a scan that looks at how different parts of the brain are taking up glucose and using it, which can then be used as a marker for functioning. You can also look at DTI, which is looking at the white matter tracks and the wires that interconnect the brain. In addition, you can also think about the brain in an electrical way. There are complex electrical signals, the limbocortical circuits, and we can, through an EEG, we can see how the frequencies of the brain change with different experiences. So the brain is incredibly complex. I think many of us have heard of fMRI, functional MRI, and that's using a trick of the magnet to look at changes in blood flow. And you're using increased blood flow or decreased blood flows as markers of neuronal activity. And this allows us in healthy humans to put them into a scanner and have them do various techniques, or even watch them in a resting state to see how they function in a resting state. So there's many different ways to organize and think about the brain. And how the brain is involved and associated with different forms of memory and experience. I'd like to turn now specifically to the study of consciousness and what I mean by it, and also talk a little bit about the difference between perception and experience. So perception, our bodies are constantly collecting information. Our bodies are constantly collecting visual information and processing, sensory information and processing it. And most of the information that our body collects, we're actually not really aware of it. For example, you're sitting now perhaps upright in a chair, and there's incredibly complex neuronal processes assessing the stretch of the muscles in your paraspinal muscles in your back. There are nerve roots that are going up through the spine to the cerebellum. There's the vestibular apparatus. Most of that sensory information that you are collecting and processing, you are not experiencing and aware of. Similar, there's very complex visceral information coming from the autonomic nervous system, from your heart and from your gut, that are guiding, that are detecting the chemical makeup of your blood, that are detecting the blood pressure in your body. And your body is responding in a very complex way through that sensation and perception without you having a phenomenal experience. You don't experience that data. Consciousness or phenomenal experiences, that's what I mean by that, is a lot more challenging to define. There's something it's like to see the color red, to experience seeing the color red, which is separable and different from the perception itself. You can imagine an organism that could collect data, sensory data, at the wavelength of red and respond to it. You can think of a bee that can identify a flower of a red color and know that the red flower has a delicious pollen, and can go and sense the data, perceive it, and make actions towards that red flower without having a visual experience of red. And so there's the perception, the ability to collect and interpret information is different than having an experience, having a phenomenal experience. And to the experiencer, these are very real and often the unspoken basis of a lived physical world and a personal sense of existence. And so the key point that I'd like to then make is that phenomenal experience, what it's like to see the color red, to taste chocolate, to hear your friend's voice. These involve a biological process. And we can, through investigation, empirical investigation, get a better understanding of its underlying physiology. One great example of the difference between what you can perceive and what you can experience is the cocktail party effect. Here you are in a very loud bar, back in the days where we would do such things. And here you are in the corner having a conversation with your friend leaning in, but there's dozens of other conversations going on in the room. And then you're really focused on your friend and they're saying something quite interesting. And then suddenly your name is called from the other side of the room and you turn your head. Does this mean that your brain is hearing, sensing, and perceiving every single conversation in the room and then focusing its attention suddenly when your name is called? It must be that to some extent, even on an unconscious level, your brain is collecting sensory information, processing it and perceiving it, so that when your name is called, you can turn to it. And this is an important key point in terms of the difference between phenomenal experience and perception. There's this large project to look at the neural correlates of consciousness. What are the brain processes that are specific to consciousness? And this is exploded, starting with the work of Christoph Koch in the 1990s, and now is a huge field with many different areas. And so there's the neural substrates, the level of consciousness, and Dr. Vold talked about sleeping and dreaming, and I think that's a very important point, because wakefulness is often considered to be the same thing as consciousness. I think wakefulness is necessary for certain forms of conscious phenomenal experience, but they're not the only ones. For example, when we dream and we have a visual experience of a dream, I would say you're having a conscious phenomenal experience. Then there are the neural correlates of consciousness, the approach to investigate the very specific neural substrates that underlie a given type of experience. And moreover, there's background conditions like glucose and blood flow. We wouldn't say that blood flow or glucose is consciousness, but they seem to be necessary, at least into the brain, for somebody to have a conscious experience. I'm going to turn in the last 15 minutes now specifically to talk about visual perception and visual phenomenal experience as a key test case for the neural correlates of consciousness, because it's actually one of the most studied areas in neural correlates of consciousness. Some background on the neuroanatomy of vision. The eyes collect light, and light is moved down the optic nerve to various parts of the brain to process it. Here's the optic nerve, the optic tracts, the radiations, and they go back to V1, the primary visual cortex that's in the occipital lobe. It's been described since Holmes and others studied soldiers who were injured, who had the back of their heads injured in World War I from shrapnel injuries, that the area in the brain where an injury occurs seems to associate very clearly with the type of loss of vision that the person has. These are visual fields as if you're looking out. So this is the right eye and the left eye, and the area of red is the area of blindness. So if you end up having a lesion, an injury to this part, this right part of the brain in the occipital lobe, you end up having a left homonymous hemianopia, which means it's not just that one eye you're missing the vision, it's in both eyes on the left side you're missing the vision. But it's not like when you just close a single eye and it's dark, it's something else. So I'd like together with you right now to do a brief phenomenological exploration of vision. So right now, if you'll humor me, everyone at home, you have the tools right in front of you, I think, most people. Take your hands and make an L and a mirror L with the other hand, and put them together like goalposts and place them at arm's length, right in the center of your vision, okay? Right in the center of your vision. And now, stay centered and close your left eye. Keep your right eye open, okay? And now, look at the nail. Don't move your head, just move your eye, and look at the nail of your left index finger, okay? And as you look at as you're looking at the left index finger, the fingernail of the left index finger on this side, the right finger should disappear. It's gone. If it doesn't work, move it in and out a bit until it ends up in your blind spot. And what you'll see is I want to make two phenomenological points and then describe the neurological underpinnings. 2 points. Number one, there isn't a black spot, there isn't a darkness where your right index finger is. It looks normal vision to you. You know that it's there. If you turn it and you move it to a different background, let's say a white background, it's not black, it's white. If you move it to a brown background or a black background, the area that's missing appears black, okay? So why does this happen? It's your blind spot, and here in the eye, there's photoreceptors in the eye that are collecting light, and then they need to transmit through nerves into the brain. And so the area in the eye where the nerves are entering does not have photoreceptors, it can't collect light, and that ends up with a blind spot. And so that area of the eye, throughout your entire life, if you ever looked around with one eye open, there is a blind hole there, and you are completely unaware of it. You don't see a blackness, you don't see a blindness, you're just missing visual information, number one. And point number two, your brain is inventing a visual scene. Your brain is constantly inventing a visual scene that makes you, that makes you think that there's something filled in, but it's not there. There's a complete disconnect, at least in that blind spot, between what you're perceiving, what's out in the physical world, and what you're experiencing phenomenally. I'd like to turn now to some of the experiments on vision. This is Helen. She's a monkey who Humphrey and others removed the primary visual cortex, and she was left with a blind field, really couldn't see very much. Initially, she would walk around. She couldn't walk around or see, but later she developed the ability to walk around. There's great videos online, but I don't think they play well on Zoom, so I'll just show you images. She was able to have some intact residual visual processing. She could reach for currents that were put in front of her and accurately run around a maze, even though she couldn't see, even though she was blind. And this led to a lot of discussions and experiments to try and try and understand how there's intact visual perception in people who have injuries to their brains. So I'd like now to turn to the phenomena of blindsight, which is a rare disorder that we've been studying, and use it as hopefully a test case for how we can get a better understanding of the neural correlates of visual phenomenal experience and visual consciousness. The first patient described really in the literature in 1973 and 1974 by Weisskranz and others was a patient who had a vascular malformation in the right occipital lobe, and he ended up finally needing to undergo surgery because he had disabling headaches from it. He was left with a left homonymous hemianopia, which means he couldn't see the left side of the visual world. Larry Weisskranz, who'd been working in some of those monkeys, had developed some other techniques to try and assess for intact visual perception in those who have blindness. And what he did was he had an interesting paradigm. So he took DB, and he has a blind field. He can't see on the left side of his body. And he would flash lights in the blind field. And he would say to the patient DB, he'd say, "Do you see it?" He'd say, "No." He says, "Doesn't matter. I want you to point to it." And the patient would say, "I can't see it." He'd say, "Well, guess." He said, there's quotes like, "How can I guess it's something I can't see?" And Larry and the other doctors would say, "Well, point anyway." And what they found was, even though DB would swear up and down that he couldn't experience seeing, he could very accurately point to a stimulus that was in his blind field. He could direct eye movements to a stimulus in his blind field. And they went further. They would put vertical lines and horizontal lines in his blind field and say, was it vertical or horizontal? Was there an X or an O? And it wasn't just that he did better than chance in perceiving stimuli that he couldn't see. He did almost at 95% accuracy for some that he swore up and down he couldn't see. This led to a big discussion and a lot of debate in the literature about consciousness and about vision. And so blindsight then is a rare disorder where an injury causes a loss of visual phenomenal experience, while visual perception remains to some degree intact. There was then the attempt to find a lot more patients who had this disorder. This is GY. And as you can see, the lesion, the injury is here in the primary visual cortex. And he was tested extensively as well and also showed the phenomena of blindsight. I'd like to now talk a little bit more about a framework for disorders of visual consciousness that we're working on. And so I'd say this is a kind of a very broad model. There is visual phenomenal experience. There's the experience of seeing something. There's the perception. There's the collection of sense data. And then there's the awareness that you're having a visual experience. Somebody has cortical blindness. They have complete loss of vision. They have none of these. They lose them all. There are situations where somebody has the loss of perception, but has experience and awareness. We all have this when we dream. If you have a visual dream, you're having experience, you're having a visual phenomenal experience, you're aware that you're having a visual experience, but you're not perceiving anything. You're not collecting data from the world. It's something that's occurring in the parts of your brain that are the visual association areas. Similarly, people have migraine auras or visual hallucinations that are also very well-formed visual experiences that are not collecting light data. Blindsight then is perception in the absence of experience. And so therefore the thought is that by studying blindsight more, we can get a better understanding about the neural correlates of experience. What happens that you wipe out this experience? You can also do testing, and I'll show you some experiments in healthy controls using manipulations of attention or vision to be able to mimic this to some degree where somebody has intact perception in the absence of experience. There's other syndromes such as Anschau's syndrome, which is very striking. I've only seen 2 cases where people have complete cortical blindness, but they really believe that they can see. And they get up and walk around and trip, and they swear up and down that they can see, and they confabulate. They make up their visual, what they see in the visual world, but they're not seeing anything. Okay, so this is one of the really seminal experiments done by Stanislas Dehaene, a French neuroscientist, to look at the difference in the brain pattern in the fMRI signal between stimuli that are experienced versus those that are not. He used a visual masking paradigm, which is where you present a word briefly, and then you follow it with a scrambled mask. If you follow it soon enough with a scrambled mask, the subjects who are in the experiment will say they didn't experience seeing a word. If you give enough of a period of time between the word and the mask, the subjects experience seeing the word. And what he did was then, he tested them to make sure that it was accurate, and it was. Their report was accurate. And then he did an fMRI in these different conditions. In the condition where the stimulus is masked, where the word is masked, where the subjects say, I did not experience seeing the word at all, what's interesting is you see activations in the fusiform gyrus. The area is specifically called the visual word form area, which is involved in perceiving words. So even though they didn't experience seeing the word, they do have activations in the in the cortex along the ventral visual stream that's involved in recognizing words and letters. The difference, though, what occurs when the word is visible is a very different activation pattern. You see increased activation in the fusiform gyrus, in the visual word form area, the area that you expect to be activated when you present a word. But there's this frontoparietal activation, there's this diffuse frontoparietal activation that occurs when the word is visible. The thought being then that there's this frontal parietal activation that occurs, and that is the neural correlate of visual phenomenal experience of seeing. This has been repeated in many other modalities, including in sound. Here, they present sounds at a frequency and volume that is so low that it's perceived about half the time. When the sound is reported as not being experienced by the subject, you see activations in the superior temporal gyrus, in Heschel's gyrus, in the primary auditory cortex. You see activations in the area where you'd expect sound to be involved. But then when the sound is experienced as being heard, you see frontoparietal activations throughout the rest of the brain, giving further weight to the fact that a frontoparietal network, this kind of global activation pattern, seems to be associated with having a phenomenal experience versus just having a perception. There's debate about this, and some will argue that really it's just the posterior part of the brain that's involved in phenomenal experience. The frontal lobes are involved in attention and task monitoring rather than phenomenal experience itself. This is a very exciting experiment by Tononi and others in Wisconsin, where they had high density EEG on subjects who were sleeping, and they woke them up from sleep and they said, "Were you dreaming?" And they asked them, "What were you dreaming about?" And when somebody was experiencing a dream, they had this kind of posterior hot zone activation. And when they were not experiencing a dream, they didn't, at 1 to 4 hertz. And they even were able to go even further, and they were able to show how people who were having a dream that had speech were having increased activation in the Wernicke's area. People who were seeing a face were in that same fusiform gyrus that's involved in perceiving faces. And so they would say, look, the frontal lobes are not really involved in consciousness and conscious perception. They're really just involved in attention and task monitoring. I'd like to now return to blindsight and then kind of wrap things up. There's been a lot of attempts to try and understand the causes of blindsight. That traditional focal neurology that we talked about at the beginning that explained many syndromes like amnesia and aphasia has not worked with blindsight. Here you see a group of subjects who had blindsight and not blindsight, and the area, the focal location of the lesion, was not able to differentiate between patients with blindsight or without blindsight. This is a somewhat simplified schematic of some of the other visual pathways, and the thought is that there must be an intact visual pathway that does not go through the traditional pathway to the primary visual cortex that explains it. To simplify it a bit, we went through at the beginning the geniculate pathway, but there's extrageniculate pathways. There are pathways that bypass the lateral geniculate nucleus that go through the superior colliculus. The superior colliculus has a map of the world that helps direct eye movements, especially vertical eye movements. There are other pathways from the lateral geniculate nucleus that don't go back to the primary visual cortex and the occipital lobe, but go to other visual association areas. And the thought would be if you wipe out the primary visual cortex, you're not having this connection between the primary visual cortex and the visual association cortices, and that leads to the loss of experience. But you still have some intact attention, some intact perception, because the information gets the association cortices. This is an older fMRI study of GY, and it shows that when he is not aware of visual stimuli, it's in the superior, he has activation in the superior colliculus, and that's why he can direct his eye towards a target that he doesn't experience seeing. But when he does experience seeing it, there's more of a diffuse frontoparietal activation like we saw in some of the healthy patients. This is a very large study, one of the largest, comes out of the Holly Bridge and Sarah Gina's group in the UK, where they looked at a lot of subjects with blindsight and without blindsight negative. And they showed that activations in V5, the visual motion area, is really important for having a phenomenal experience, having blindsight. And so they hypothesized that it must be pathways to V5, the visual motion area, that's involved. Others, such as the subject MC, who was studied at Penn in 2008, she showed intact activations in the primary visual cortex, the thought being that you need to reach a certain threshold of activation to have a phenomenal experience, but having reduced activations, but still some activations allow some degree of perception. There's also an attempt to look at the wiring, the white matter connections in the brain, and this is also from Holly Bridge's group that looks at intact pathways from the lateral geniculate nucleus, as well as the possible causes. So there's a lot of debate then in the literature about the causes of blindsight and what leads to the intact perception, and there's a lot of different candidate areas, both in functional or imaging, as well as tractography, where we look at white matter connections that seem to account for the intact perception and may give us some additional information in terms of what causes neural correlates of visual phenomenal experience. This is some work that I'll just talk about briefly and then wrap up. This is some work that I'm doing together with Michael in Mike Fox's lab, looking at all the cases in literature that cause blind sight. We've collected 34 lesions, and as we review the lesions, we've attempted to look at where they overlap, and it's really not easy to identify what the difference between a blind sight positive versus a blind sight negative patient is based on where the lesion itself is. Those who are blind sight negative, somewhat more extensive lesions, but the actual focal location seems quite similar in this medial occipital lobe. So we're working on using this technique that's developed by Mike Fox called lesion network mapping, where you're looking at the inherent functional connectivity of the brain, and you end up using the lesion as a seat of interest to look at where the lesion that caused the specific syndrome disrupts the functional networks of the brain. And what we're beginning to find is that there seems to be an activation of the pulvinar and somewhat more elaborate network that involves the pulvinar, the optic radiations, some visual association areas in V5, as well as some areas in the orbitofrontal cortex, but we're still working on that. So that's some of the work that we're doing to try and identify the causes of the disruption of the neurocorrelates of consciousness, with the broader project and the broader idea that in the end, in neurodegenerative diseases, such as Alzheimer's disease and in Lewy body dementia, there are also disruptions of phenomenal experience, and we're hoping to get a better understanding of those mechanisms to try and help patients with those disorders. I'll wrap up now just with a very brief run through a few other important concepts. We talked a lot about the relationship between consciousness, visual phenomenal experience, and perception, and how they can be separated. But this is a huge field. People will say that consciousness and language are so interwoven that we can't unwrap them. Everything I've said right now, the whole problem is in language. Maybe it's really just language where the problem emerges. But I think that patients who have aphasia, who lose language, are actually quite capable of having a phenomenal experience. Children who have not yet developed language, I think, also have phenomenal experiences they experience. And then the question of, do animals have consciousness? Do other objects have consciousness? I don't see anything that would say that we should deprive animals of having phenomenal experience. The problem of subjective report is really a major one in consciousness research. Just because I can't communicate with an animal doesn't mean that they're not having a phenomenal experience. So I would plead agnosticism to that. Consciousness and memory. Some will say that memory is very interwoven, and it really depends on the specific type of memory. Working memory, which is our moment-to-moment memory, for example, when we're looking at a visual scene, there's a lot of elements to it. It's not just an instant, it's actually dozens of milliseconds that we're putting together. So that element of working memory is part of attention, and to have a well-formed binding of a phenomenal experience, you probably do need some degree of working memory. But episodic memory, that person who is amnestic, probably does have a phenomenal experience. There are times where we'll drive on a familiar road and we'll be done with 10 minutes of driving. We'll go, you won't remember anything. I think you had phenomenal experience of that. You experienced driving the road. You didn't crash. I think you experienced seeing it. If you were, brought into the moment you would be experiencing, but you just didn't form a memory of it. Consciousness and introspection. Most of the time when I talk about consciousness, people will say, what is that, the self? And so the self is a very complex topic and beyond the scope now, but it involves the sense of an autobiographical self, the sense of agency and other things. There can be neurological processes where people have out-of-body experiences and times where we lose our sense of self. If you're running down a mountain at a fast speed, you're so engrossed, you're not saying I have a self, but I still think you're having a phenomenal experience. And so I think those are separable. Consciousness and attention is a much more complex topic to dissociate. It seems that probably you might need attention to have a phenomenal experience, but you can have attention, you can focus on specific stimuli without having a conscious experience. So I'd like to now wrap up with a few key points. Consciousness, the key postulate that I would hope you get is that consciousness involves a biological process that can be investigated empirically for its underlying physiology. Blindsight is a clinical syndrome where some visual perception is intact, but visual phenomenal experience is disrupted. And I hope that blindsight can serve as a key disorder of phenomenal experience in a test case for the neurocorrelates of consciousness. Thank you so much.